So we jump to the next really big time Latin root, and that is humus or humus, which in Latin literally means soil. Okay, it's often translated as earth, but it means soil. Now we get into some interesting, way more than cur, interesting relationships between the root and words. When we dealt with the currents and we dealt with concurrents and all those other cur words, even though they were used figuratively in interesting ways, you know, and there was a real expansion of the sphere of meanings for it. When you get to whom or hum, it starts getting really weird because it's connected to ancient Greek mythology. It's connected to the ancient Greek notions of where, spoiler, human beings came from. Okay, the notion that in the most popular myths about humans, they were created from soil, created from the earth, okay, connected to the earth. And so you have humus or humus in English. It's actually a word in English dealing with the soil. Human, humanity, and humanize. The reason why I'm putting these other words in parentheses after the first word is to give you practice with using the different suffixes and prefixes, and or to help you expand the palette of the first word, the meanings of it. So in the case of humanity and humanize, it's nothing but the first. It's nothing but practice with suffixes. So human beings, according to the ancient Greeks, came from the soil, were made from the soil. Depending on which myth you look at, Prometheus made them out of the soil, Hephaestus, it depends on which myth you're looking at, but they have in common that idea that human beings are made from the soil. Now, why is that? It has to do with the other words that are coming up that are related to the HUM root. Okay? It has to do with the fact that we are of the soil as opposed to whom. Who is that being contrasted with? The gods, the divinities, the immortals, the ones who don't have to die. So if you are human, you are mortal, which literally means you have to die. Mors in Latin is death. Again, that's going to be one of the roots that we're going to deal with later in the semester, most likely. Okay? So to be human is to be of the earth, and by extension, to be not a god. Okay? And that's a giant deal. That is the biggest and most emphasized contrast in ancient Greek mythology between having to die and not having to die, because you don't need to have myth. You don't have to have any stories dealing with why things are and the tragedy of having to die by definition if you don't have to die. Okay, so it's that basis that's the basis for all of those for that notion of a contrast between humans and divinities. And then humanity, you guys know that the Y means the state of or being human. Okay, so that's the noun dealing with the adjective human, or incorporating it. And then humanize, as you know, from the Greek suffix eyes, from izo, meaning to make, do or make. So to make someone human. So let's take a look at what we might think about. So to humanize something would be like this. You have these kind of, not quite stick figures, but close to it, without any personalities, and then by writing faces, you're getting across that they are human beings with minds behind them by just putting those little marks there with the smiley face and the eyes. And that's to humanize something. Now, obviously, there are other ways that that word is used. To humanize someone who is a terrible person, you would say that good things about them in order to make them more attractive, say in a court of law or whatever, but you get the point, okay? To make human, or to make more human. All right. The same thing there. If you have, say, a profile on LinkedIn, thanks. Yeah, the idea here is, hey, get some pictures up there that make, show how friendly it is to, work in this place and this and that. So you're humanizing the workplace. That's one way to go. And so to humanize your content, that's what they're talking about. All right. Now we get into some interesting offshoots of this idea of human that get into the ethical realm. that I find most interesting. I mean, this is one of the most interesting roots because after all, we are human, so it's good to understand where all these words come from. When someone is humane, that's an adjective built from human, okay? And so as far as, this is not adding a suffix, so don't sweat it. So if I were to ask you humane, all I would ask for is the root, okay? There's no real suffix there. Except for the meaning being. So being of the earth. Okay, but the E doesn't add anything other than what? And here's another thing I'm going to bring up today that I may not bring up a bunch of times in the future. And that is, quite often changes are made to simple words in order to expand the palette for that root. But as far as why that particular change was made as opposed to another is seemingly random. Okay? So why is it humane and not humanic? Or human, whatever other prefix you want to add? No one knows. You can guess, you can look for patterns, but the bottom line is it's kind of creative. It's a creative morphing of language in order to expand the horizons of the meaning. So if you have human from humus, humus meaning soil, meaning earth, and then human, the creatures from the soil, according to ancient Greek mythology. And then you get this idea of what it means to what? What does humane mean? It means being the best human you can be. Think of the word human, and you just torque it to be able to change it enough to where now, hey, good, now I can put this meaning onto it. Okay? So yeah, the E doesn't change things from without the E to what it is, meaning the best example of something, if you get my drift. Okay? It just happens to be for human. Okay? There are other reasons for putting E's at the end of things that has nothing to do with that. Okay? Okay, so to be humane is to be the best human you could be, and then guess what? The opposite of that, not mean, and by the way, I forgot to say, in obviously also means not, we learned, right? So into not, and then I just told you it also means against. So it's really 4 different things. And you just don't know except through context which one it is. But we all know just by speaking English well enough to understand these words impressionistically, the difference between in, into, not, and against, at least usually. Inhumane is to treat others than humans in a not friendly and in a not compassionate way. So in this case at least, to be humane is determined by how we treat others than humans who are at least, how do we put it, not in terms of quality or anything, but in terms of, I guess you'd call it power, beneath us. They depend on us. And so it's the weaker creatures in the world and how we treat them that some would say reflects our humaneness more than anything else. And so that's kind of the idea here. Okay. Now, this class is offered in Classics and Humanities department, so I might as well have something to say about humanities. Okay. Humanities, this is one of, now we need to, another thing to bring up today. Humanities, there's a reason for the IES, but I don't want to bog you down with every single suffix and the reason for it. It almost always has to do with linguistic stuff, though. It has to do with having to know Latin in order to really get why it is what it is. So when I gave you all those suffixes and prefixes at the beginning of the semester, I was very selective about which ones I wanted to dwell on and which ones I don't. Okay? So as far as humanities go, just think of it in terms of plural. It has to do with things having to do with, right, the best of what is human. Okay, good enough. Otherwise, I have to get real grammatical with you and linguistic to explain that ending. Okay? But the idea here, as it says there, is humanities are academic disciplines that study aspects of human society and culture. It comes from the Renaissance, and it is in contrast with the church. So it is a post-medieval label given to things other than religious, okay, in the Renaissance, because part of it had to do with this idea of bringing back what was considered to be best about what preceded the Middle Ages, okay, at least from one standpoint. And so the word Renaissance itself means rebirth. Naissance, okay, in French means birth, and re means again. So rebirth of what? The greatest of what Greece and Rome produced. Okay, so the Renaissance really did fashion itself, or I should say conceive of itself as a bringing back ancient Greece and Rome, or the best that there was to bring. And that's really where humanities comes from, the idea of it. And classics is connected to that. Okay, I don't want to go too far afield here. All right, so now we get more literal and therefore boring. If you ask me, the human stuff is kind of interesting because it gets figurative, but this is no big deal. Exhume literally means take from the ground. Okay, so when you unbury something, you exhume. And it usually is and it's pronounced exhume, and it's usually referring to take something out that was actively put in there, as opposed to discover something like an archaeologist, something, like a body or something for forensic purposes or whatever. Okay, so you exhume a body. You take it, and then the state of doing that would be exhumation. Okay, I only put that just to give you practice with the suffixes, just to let you know how much you know by knowing those suffixes. Now, maybe my favorite offshoot from the hum root is this idea of humility, okay, being humble. Here we go again, you guys, okay? This is back to, the issue of, why is it? You're going to find many examples of this BLE ending that have nothing whatsoever to do with the idea of being, knowing your place in the universe. Is what humility is, right? Knowing your place in an ancient Greek context with respect to the gods, knowing that you are only human, knowing that you're born from the earth as opposed to being a god. That's what humility is, okay? In an ancient Greek context. It's the opposite of what? It's the opposite of hubris. Okay, hubris is overweening pride, thinking that because you're so great that you're one step away from a god, if not a god itself. Okay, and now heroes were very guilty of that because they had divinity in them, but the gods would constantly remind them, such as Odysseus in the Odyssey, that they had to be careful not to let hubris overwhelm them. And then humility is just the state of that, the state of being humble. So to be humble is an extension of this idea of being humane, right? You're humane. Why are you humane? Because you don't think you're a god. Why don't you think, it's a kind of another offshoot from the idea of being born from the earth. To be humble is to know your place in the universe. And then, interestingly, now this is really interesting. Pay attention to this, you guys. To be humble is to admit that you're beneath the gods. Literally, they live in Olympus. They're above. They're either on the highest mountain in Greece or in the sky, depending on what part of Greek history you're talking about, with how Olympus was conceived. So to be humble is to be beneath the gods in a positive way. To consider yourself to be beneath in a positive way, and yet to humiliate someone, and we already know what 8 means, so I don't have to bore you with that, because I already did bore you with it when we learned all those suffixes. So it means to make, to do or make, in this case to make. To make what? To make humble? No. It doesn't mean to make humble. It means to make feel like ish. It means to make feel terrible. It means to make you drill you into the ground. So now we're using whom in a literal way, and that's why I have exhume first, because we're bringing back the literal use of whom, meaning just nothing but take it from the earth. And now we're pretty literally / figuratively, meaning when we use humiliate, driving into the ground, to rub someone's face in the dirt, is what humiliate is. See that, you guys? So now all of a sudden, we're using whom in a more literal way, as in the sense of down, but not in the positive way of humble or humane, but more humble than anything else, right? So when you're humble, you're down, and that's a good thing. When you're humiliated, you're down, and it's a terrible thing. Okay? So it's an interesting thing to pay attention to the malleability, the changeability, the morphability, the shape-changing ability of these roots in order to accommodate different meanings. And it shouldn't confuse you, though. What you should realize, what you should take away from that, is that the priority of those who came up with these words was the ideas they wanted to express, and then they did the best they could to change the words in order to accommodate that. And that's what's going on with all this, the BLE ending. That's what's going on with the E added to human. Okay? You're apparently more or less randomly and arbitrarily choosing endings that are linguistically sound in Latin, in Greek, in order to expand the horizons of these various roots.